to separate the bad from the good.
Sounds like a job. Verbal diorama. She watches all the movies from comedy to drama. From the top roll sound. And don't forget the action. She'll watch until the end and then she'll give you her reaction. Movies you know, movies you don't. Prequel, sequels, remakes, and trivia and outtake. Movies you know, movies you don't. Interesting stories, all the categories.
Hi everyone, I'm Em and welcome to Verbal Diorama episode 275, A Nightmare on Elm Street. This is the podcast that's all about the history and legacy of movies you know and movies you don't. And as always, welcome to Verbal Diorama, whether you are a brand new listener, whether you are a regular returning listener. Thank you for being here. Thank you for choosing to listen to this podcast. And I'm so happy to have you here for the history and legacy of Nightmare on Elm Street. And just so you know, I have a cold. My voice is not 100%, so apologies if it doesn't sound quite right, but I am completely bunged up at the moment. And unfortunately, it is spooky season, but it's also the season where literally everything spreads around and I've managed to catch something off someone. And so I've dosed myself up on Lemsips. I'm not sure what they're called around the world, but it's basically just like a paracetamol drink with like honey and lemon. I've dosed myself up just to record this episode. And hopefully I can get through it without coughing, spluttering, saying something weird. Oh, actually, I say something weird all the time, so scrap that one. But I just wanted to let you know up front, if I sound a bit weird, it's because I've got this thing going on with my nose and my throat and all of that sort of stuff. But huge thank you to everyone who is listening to this podcast, who has listened to this podcast, and who continues to listen to and support this podcast. And over the time period that I've been doing this podcast, which is coming up to 6 years, would you believe? In February next year, it's going to be 6 years. This is episode 275, which also means early next year is going to be the 300th episode of this podcast. And I have no idea what to do for the 300th episode. So if you do want to get in touch and you want to suggest a 300th episode, please feel free. Contact me on social media at Verbal Diorama. Contact me on my email address, verbaldiorama@gmail.com. Let me know what you think would be a good 300th episode that's not the movie 300, because I feel like that's a bit on the nose. But, as I say, thank you so much for your continued support. It means so much to me as an indie podcaster who does everything for this podcast on her own, every week, without fail. Even when I'm sick, I still have to do this podcast and I still have to get this podcast out. But genuinely, to hear such lovely messages that I get on email and on social media, it really pushes me to keep going, regardless of the fact of whether I'm sick or not, to keep going on this podcast. So thank you so much. And especially for the recent episodes. So Bill and Ted Face the Music came out recently, and also Child's Play came out recently too. And obviously we're getting into spooky season, like I said, and I am always asked to cover more horror movies. So this month I am delivering. And I'm delivering literally the creme de la creme of slasher horror, because I wanted to do a complete slasher season going through the 70s and the 80s. And I wanted to continue after Child's Play, going back in time a little bit with a genuinely terrifying presence that haunts your dreams, because we all dream. And so how do you hide from someone who can not only find you in dreams, but murder you in dreams? And what if it was all because of the actions of your dear old mum and dad? And this is, of course, the only horror icon that I'm going to be talking about in this particular month to have been played consistently by the same actor across all of the franchise, except for the 2010 remake. We are going to have to talk about the 2010 remake, but apart from that one, consistently by the same actor, which is quite incredible, really, when you think about slasher horror. Generally, they're behind a mask. But this guy, his face is the mask. Here's the trailer for A Nightmare on Elm Street.
The kids of Elm Street don't know it yet, but something is coming to get them.
There's something out there, isn't there?
We just see cuts happen.
What did that, Lieutenant?
I don't know.
What has the coroner got to say?
He's in the jar and puking since he saw it.
They're gonna kill me for sure.
Did you do it?
There was somebody else there.
He was locked in a room with a girl who went in alive and came out in a rubber bag.
No one knows where it came from or who it will visit next.
Nancy? There's something wrong with you. You're imagining things.
Nightmare on Elm Street.
Do you believe in the boogeyman?
No.
Whatever you do, don't fall asleep.
She's the only one who can stop it. If she fails,
I'm your boyfriend now, Nancy.
no one will survive. From Wes Craven, director of The Hills Have Eyes and Last House on the Left, a new masterpiece in fantasy terror, Nightmare on Elm Street.
The teens at Elm Street have started to have nightmares about a creepy man with a striped sweater and a fedora with a knifed glove who haunts their dreams. Slowly but surely they realise that if he kills their friends in their dreams, they are killed in real life. Nancy Thompson witnesses the brutal deaths of her friends and boyfriend before discovering that the parents of Elm Street murdered Fred Krueger in vigilante justice after he got off being jailed for child murders through a technicality. Krueger is now haunting the dreams of their children. Let's run through the cast. We have Heather Langenkamp as Nancy Thompson, Robert Englund as Fred Krueger, Johnny Depp as Glenn Lance, Ronnie Blakely as Marge Thompson, John Saxon as Lieutenant Donald Thompson, Amanda Wyss as Tina Gray, and Nick Corey as Rod Lane. A Nightmare on Elm Street was written and directed by Wes Craven. And Wes Craven has the distinction, nay, the honour, of being responsible for not just the slasher renaissance of the mid-80s, but also the slasher renaissance of the mid-90s too. And I have done an episode on Scream, that one is episode 64. But this was a guy who had horror at the forefront of his mind and consistently reinvented the slasher genre. But our story starts with New Line Cinema. And when New Line Cinema first opened its doors in 1967, Hollywood was coming to the end of a turbulent decade. New artists were challenging American cinema entertainment. The collapse of the Hays Code, which since the 1930s had severely limited what could and could not be shown in films, was only a year away. A new era was beginning for Hollywood cinema. And Robert Shea, the creator of New Line Cinema, aims to take advantage of those opportunities by creating a new kind of film distributor. New Line distributed controversial American films like Reefer Madness, as well as foreign films like Get Out Your Handkerchiefs and The Street Fighter, all primarily acquired in the 1970s. But the studio also started its horror film venture during this decade, with John Waters' Multiple Maniacs distributed by New Line in 1970 and The Cars That Ate Paris in 1976. The distributor's affinity for the counterculture of the 1970s was reflected in the transgressive nature of these and other New Line Cinema releases, such as Immoral Tales. But by the 1980s, one unexpected hit would give New Line Cinema a brand new identity centered around the horror genre, and it would link to New Line's rebranding as not just a distributor of film, but a production company in its own right. New Line began in the 1980s with a desire to expand into making movies in-house. And they wanted horror movies because horror was a relatively cheap genre with a lot of mainstream appeal and huge box office potential. Their first attempt was a 1982 slasher called Unknown in the Dark, starring Jack Palance, Martin Landau and Donald Pleasance, which didn't do particularly well, but it was a foot in the door. After the huge successes of both Halloween and Friday the 13th, the slasher genre was becoming saturated with cheap, clichéd imitations. But really, it's no wonder that many of the studios wanted a piece of that pie. And it wasn't just a few studios either. Films like The Burning, My Bloody Valentine, Night School, The Slumber Party Massacre, which was a rarity in the genre for being written and directed by a woman, Sleepaway Camp as well, they were among the many slashers that came out between 1980 and 1983. But after a few years of popularity, it seemed like the slasher era was over. But that was until Wes Craven entered the picture. In the 60s, Craven was a humanities teacher at a college in upstate New York, but he wasn't happy with the direction his career was taking. So he moved to New York City and got a job at a movie studio as a messenger. His friend, Sean Cunningham, suggested that Craven write a scary movie and use his Christian fundamentalist upbringing to tap into the horror. That script became the controversial 1972 revenge movie The Last House on the Left, which ended up making 3 times its budget. Craven followed it up with The Hills Have Eyes, which received good reviews. After the contractually obligated sequel to The Hills Have Eyes and Swamp Thing, the work dried up. His first marriage failed and he started taking drugs to cope. He eventually stopped with the cocaine, and one day in 1981, he had an idea. He came across an article in the LA Times about a family that had made it out of the killing fields in Cambodia and immigrated to the United States. Everything was very well until the son started experiencing really unsettling nightmares. He tried to stay awake for days at a time, telling his parents he was afraid the thing chasing him would get him if he fell asleep. When he did eventually nod off, his parents thought the problem was over. Then, in the middle of the night, they heard screams. The boy had passed away by the time they reached him. In the middle of a nightmare, this young man had just died. It wasn't an isolated incident either. There were reports of men fleeing war and genocide in Laos and Vietnam, suffering terrible nightmares and refusing to sleep because of them. And when they did sleep, they would end up dying in the night. It was suspected to be sudden unexplained death syndrome, but the idea of being nightmared to death was the central premise that awakened something in Wes Craven. But he needed an idea to explain the deaths. And he would remember seeing a drunk homeless man wearing a fedora when he was a child. The man walked past his house and glanced directly at the young Wes Craven, staring him half to death. The man would walk off, but the image of the man and the feeling of terror that Wes Craven had would serve as inspiration for the character of Fred Krueger. Not Freddy. He would become Freddy in subsequent movies. A spate of high-profile news stories about child molestation made Craven decide against explicitly confirming Freddy was a paedophile, something that the 2010 remake would reinstate. And because every horror villain, Michael Myers, Jason Voorhees, and Leatherface, wore some sort of mask, Craven wanted Krueger to also have one, but also wanted his face to be seen so he could taunt and threaten his victims. So he came up with the idea that this man was burned and scarred. And as I'll come to, he didn't just want a stuntman behind his horror icon. He wanted a real actor and someone who could play the character almost continuously. Meanwhile, his friend Sean Cunningham, who also produced The Last House on the Left, would come to prominence as the director of Friday the 13th in 1980, another huge slasher hit that would also spawn its own franchise. With this new idea and a script written, a friend introduced Craven to producer Bob Shea and told him the idea. Shea loved it because everyone has experienced a nightmare and got excited about seeing a script, but Craven refused to share it. This was because Craven had already sent the script to all the big studios and all of them had passed on it. Even Sean Cunningham had told him the script wouldn't work because everyone will know that it's really just a dream, and he didn't think the audience would buy it as a premise. The current crop of slashers were firmly based in reality, or at least realism. A Nightmare on Elm Street, with its premise of a killer within your dreams, was fantastical and supernatural, and as it would happen, just the tonic for the current generation of slashers. Craven would end up framing Universal's 1982 rejection letter from Bob Raimi, saying he just didn't find anything scary in it. Craven would peddle the script around Hollywood for 3 years. Paramount would reject it due to similarities with Dreamscape. Also popular in the 80s were family-friendly fantasy movies with a bit of an edge. Think Return to Oz or Labyrinth. And Wes Craven's script had those elements within it. Remarkably, Disney also showed an interest in the script as he was peddling it around Hollywood, except they obviously wanted it to be PG-13 and for Craven to tone down his material to up the fantasy and reduce the horror. Craven declined. But Craven knew Bob Shaye was interested, and the fledgling independent New Line Cinema wanted to produce the film. The problem was they didn't really have the money to do it. They signed a co-production deal with George Zechevich of Smartech Pictures, which resulted in the production of A Nightmare on Elm Street and all of its sequels, and relied on private investors to help raise the $700,000 initial budget, including Media Home Entertainment. But throughout production, investors would back out, and Bob Shaye would have to scramble to try and find alternative investment. Media Home Entertainment would end up increasing their investment to 60%, after another investor who'd invested 40% of the budget backed out unexpectedly. Before Robert Englund personified Freddy Krueger, director Wes Craven auditioned hundreds of men for the part, both young and old, and originally chose veteran actor David Warner. Warner was lined up to star in the film and even took part in a makeup test before scheduling conflicts forced him to drop out of the role. Quite late in the casting process, Craven met with Robert Englund on the advice of casting director Annette Benson. Englund was a character actor who'd previously played a lot of good guy roles. He wasn't the sort of big, imposing guy they were looking for. He was younger, smaller, and more agile, but he wanted to play the role of someone older and evil and relished the possibility of playing a character like Freddy. Craven saw the ferocity he was looking for the character, as well as Englund being classically trained. Englund had been in a lot of best friend roles and was best known for the V miniseries and series. That show was on hiatus and he needed something more distinctive and thought this little indie film called A Nightmare on Elm Street might be it. His interpretation of Freddy was inspired by Klaus Kinski's Nosferatu, but also by the monsters that Lon Chaney created. The way Freddy stands with his legs far apart was something he admitted stealing from James Cagney. Englund attended the audition with cigarette ash under his eyes to sallow them. Craven's creation would be somewhat diluted as the franchise continued into more of a comedy character, but he originally wanted someone who could portray that lack of compassion and the darkness associated with a child murderer. And the character needed a weapon. There were already horror villains who used knives, so Craven thought of a glove with steak knives as fingers and passed the idea to mechanical special effects designer Jim Doyle, who fashioned a glove that was incredibly dangerous. He built a hero glove, the one glove that literally had sharp knives attached to the fingers, and the rest were stunt gloves. Literally every time someone wore the hero glove, they ended up cut and bleeding. Englund would spend 3 to 4 hours every day in makeup. It was the experience of testing the makeup with special makeup effects artist David Miller in pre-production that led to Krueger's signature vocal styles and profanity. It would be Englund who fought to retain the signature fedora, with the production fearing he would look too much like Indiana Jones. Once the entire look came together, the striped sweater, dirty slacks, bladed glove and fedora, it was unmistakably Freddy Krueger. But you can't have a killer without a final girl. And Craven wanted Nancy to be the girl next door, and someone very non-Hollywood. 200 actresses auditioned for the role of Nancy, with those being called back for either Nancy or the second female lead, Tina. Heather Langenkamp was 18 years old and was already known to casting director Annette Benson, as she'd previously auditioned her twice for other movies. Langenkamp just had all of the qualities they wanted for Nancy. Amanda Wyss had also read for Nancy, but she was called back for Tina, and Langenkamp and Wyss were paired together. Craven knew he had his Nancy and Tina, and their boyfriends were then cast on the basis of the chemistry between them and the girls who had already been cast. This was how they found Nick Corri for Rod and a young Johnny Depp for the role of Glenn. Charlie Sheen was almost cast as Glenn, but Annette Benson would claim he wanted too much money, which Sheen himself has denied. Glenn was originally written as a big, blonde, football-playing jock until Depp was chosen, with his headshot catching the eye of Craven's daughter. Nicolas Cage had introduced Depp to his own agent, who then introduced him to Benson, resulting in an audition for A Nightmare on Elm Street, and despite having no acting experience, he won the part of Glenn. Veteran actors John Saxon and Ronnie Blakely's names alone also helped get some additional financing, which was vital during production. There were often occasions where people just couldn't get paid. This movie got made on a lot of IOUs and good faith. Principal photography began on the 11th of June 1984 and lasted 32 days in and around Los Angeles, and not in Springwood, Ohio. Elm Street is actually North Genesee Avenue in Los Angeles, located just off Sunset Boulevard, and both Nancy and Glenn's homes are private residences with just the exteriors used for filming. But despite the financial issues, this movie invested heavily in its visual effects, including a rotating room which would pull double duty for both the death of Tina and the death of Glenn. The room cost $35,000 to rent, which was over half of Jim Doyle's visual effects budget. Craven had seen the revolving room in Royal Wedding, where Fred Astaire dances up the walls and across the ceiling. Bear in mind too, this was a small special effects team, only about half a dozen people who improvised almost everything. And this was on a production where both the actors and crew were only paid scale. For Tina's death, the room was dressed with everything glued down, the curtains starched, and the cameraman, Jacques Haitkin, and Nick Corey, who plays her boyfriend Rod, strapped into chairs. The room was manually flipped by several crew members on either side, and Amanda Wyss would have to barrel herself round as the room spun. The terror is genuine. She was petrified of the scene and of the room. Wyss also suffered from vertigo. Because of all of the blood, they only had one take to do this scene, and she managed it in just one take. Once Tina was dead, she showed up in a body bag at the school, but in a real body bag with some pinholes poked in it. Once in, Wyss couldn't actually get out on her own. 12 frames of blood had to be cut during Tina's death scene, or the film probably would have been axed. And they would come back to the same room to film Glenn's death, mostly because they had to get their money's worth out of this one room. And again, they had one take. They redressed the room as Glenn's bedroom and flipped it upside down. A sheet-lined chute for the blood was carved out of the middle of the bed, with crew members positioned above on the outside of the room, poised to pour in gallons of blood-coloured water. Unfortunately, they were pouring blood-coloured water onto a live electrical ceiling lamp, which immediately electrified the water, and everyone pouring got electrocuted. The water then started to slosh from side to side, throwing the weight off the room, and the room started to flip as crew members lost their grip. Cables and ropes were ripped out of rigging, and as the room rocked, the water flew out of the window, soaking everyone and everything. The electricity was still sparking too, so the lights would also eventually go out. The room finally stopped rocking once all the liquid was gone, leaving the crew still attached to the structure, suspended, upside down for around 20 minutes in the dark, covered in, not really blood, but blood-coloured water. And this is why, at the end of this one take, in the movie you can see the blood appearing to bend to the left. Miraculously, no one was hurt when the out-of-control, electrified, rotating death box started to rock, and they got that one take they needed, and it still looks great today. Over 500 gallons of blood-coloured water was used for the special effects. In the scene where Freddy walked through the prison bars to threaten Rod, the camera was placed again at the exact height and walked Robert Englund through the space, and then they took triangulations of the camera so they knew exactly the height of it from the floor and the angle towards the point where Freddy was going to walk through. A rotoscope artist then matted out the bars in the first image, so it looks like they are passing through his chest. A specially modified bathtub was created for Heather Langenkamp to sit in on a 2x4 plank of wood, which had an extra section at the back just big enough for Jim Doyle in a scuba suit to hide under the water. When Craven banged on the bathtub, Doyle was to stick the claw through Langenkamp's legs. It took a few takes to get right, as obviously Doyle couldn't see where the hand needed to be. All the time, Langenkamp getting colder in the water, which they had to try to keep warm. There was also a bottomless tub that sat over a swimming pool, where a stuntwoman was pulled down under the water by Freddy. And Jim Doyle really is the VIP of this production, because the version of Freddy that's trying to get Nancy through the wall wasn't actually Robert Englund, but Jim Doyle himself. He built this wall out of spandex, and it's his face and hands that stretch through the wall to reach out for Nancy while she's dreaming. And according to various sources on the internet, the melting stairs were either pancake mix, porridge, or mushroom soup, depending on who you speak to. But I think the general consensus is that it is pancake mix. Cinematographer Jacques Haitkin was tasked with creating an eerie look to both the reality and dream world to make it look like both could be interspersed with each other, and the viewer is never sure if they're in the dream world or in real life. At first, Wes Craven intended for the movie to have a more profound ending, in which Nancy kills Krueger by losing belief in him, and when she wakes up she realises the entire movie was a nightmare that had gone on for too long. But Bob Shaye insisted on a twist ending, whereby Krueger vanishes and everything appears to have been a dream, until the audiences realise it was actually a dream within a dream within a dream. Now, takes were shot with both a happy ending and a twist ending. The twist ending was used in the finished film, with Nancy driving off with her now alive friends in a car designed to look like Freddy, and Freddy pulling her mother through the doorway. That particular ending amused everyone so much that they couldn't not use it. And then they had a breakthrough on this movie, a potential deal with Paramount for distribution and marketing, and all they needed to do was screen them the movie. But during the showing, they realised that the film had the wrong ending. It had the happy ending. They didn't want to have the happy ending. They wanted to show the genuine twist ending. So editor Rick Shane's assistant had the correct ending and had 40 minutes to get a taxi to the screening. She got there, but Shane needed a few minutes extra to change to the correct ending. Bob Shaye announced to the crowd there would be a slight pause, but it completely ruined the momentum of the screening, and Paramount would end up passing on the movie. It meant New Line committing to also distributing the movie as well. And it's not really an ideal time to segue into the obligatory Keanu reference, but I'm going to give it a go anyway. This is a part of the podcast where I try to link the movie that I'm featuring with Keanu Reeves, because Keanu Reeves would never be in anyone's nightmares. He is literally everyone's dream man, and that is the way that I'm going to link this movie with Keanu Reeves, in that he would just never be in anyone's nightmares. I don't think it's possible. And also, he is the best of men, and that's why I like to do the obligatory Keanu reference. But I'm going to move on to the music, because Wes Craven was introduced to Charles Bernstein via Bernstein's agent. And when Craven elaborated on this idea that he had for a horror movie with a guy with knives for fingers, Bernstein thought it was a little bit too out there to be a really big hit. The score for A Nightmare on Elm Street was recorded in Bernstein's home studio, and home studios are commonplace now, but not really in 1983. Bernstein took more risks with this score than he normally would, mostly because he didn't think it was going to be a big hit. When he started working on the soundtrack, he already had the lyrics for Freddy's theme song, and this is the song that's sung by the children throughout the movie and is based on 1, 2, Buckle My Shoe. And he wrote them down and included them in the script. However, Heather Langenkamp's boyfriend and soon-to-be husband, musician Alan Pasqua, would end up composing the melody, and Bernstein would include Pasqua's contribution on the soundtrack. So A Nightmare on Elm Street didn't end up with that huge potential Paramount distribution deal, and it was released limited in 165 US theatres on the 9th of November 1984. It opened at 13th at the box office in its first week, which doesn't sound great till you factor in that it made its entire budget back in its first week. It would peak at 7th at the US box office in its fourth week, but thanks to positive word of mouth, just kept making similar money each week, so it was an instant commercial success. Its final budget was $1.1 million, and by the end of its limited theatrical run, it made $25 million in the US domestically and a further $32 million internationally, making a total worldwide gross of $57 million, basically making over 50 times its budget. Those investors who backed out must have been kicking themselves, and those that stuck with the production ended up reaping the benefits. And not only was it a huge financial success, but also a critical success too. Rotten Tomatoes has the movie at a 95% rating, stating Wes Craven's intelligent premise combined with the horrific visual appeal of Freddy Krueger still causes nightmares to this day. The movie was chosen as one of the 30 most important independent films of the last 30 years by the Independent Film and Television Alliance in 2010. Empire placed A Nightmare on Elm Street at 162nd on its list of the 500 best films ever made, and the New York Times has named it one of the top 1,000 films ever made. Krueger himself was ranked as the 40th villain on the American Film Institute's 100 Years, 100 Heroes and Villains list. But of course, we need to talk about the sequels. And Wes Craven didn't want to direct a sequel, and he didn't have any ongoing financial or contractual participation in sequels. And so Bob Shaye and New Line Cinema went ahead with A Nightmare on Elm Street 2: Freddy's Revenge without Craven's participation. Craven would return to the franchise along with Heather Langenkamp in 1987 for A Nightmare on Elm Street: Dream Warriors, with a co-screenwriting and co-story credit. The movie would be directed by Chuck Russell, but Craven had signed away his rights, and therefore his rights to any further compensation for sequels or merchandising. 3 further sequels, A Nightmare on Elm Street 4: The Dream Master, A Nightmare on Elm Street 5: The Dream Child, and Freddy's Dead: The Final Nightmare followed in 1988, 1989, and 1991, respectively. 10 years after A Nightmare on Elm Street, Bob Shaye called Wes Craven, offering to make one more Freddy film, even though the previous sequel was literally called Freddy's Dead: The Final Nightmare. That meeting was to talk about Wes Craven's New Nightmare, which was Wes Craven's original idea if he'd actually taken part in A Nightmare on Elm Street 2. But with Wes Craven's New Nightmare in 1994, he was finally offered a cut of the merchandising and sequels retroactively. From 1988 to 1990, Freddy's Nightmares aired on TV as a spin-off anthology series hosted by Englund as Krueger. Due to the fact that Freddy Krueger tends to murder a lot of people, New Line Cinema opted to not develop a television series with a regular cast of characters interacting with him because he would inevitably kill all of them, so they instead created an anthology series featuring a new cast of actors for each episode. The pilot was directed by Toby Hooper, and Child's Play co-writer John Lafia directed a couple of episodes of season 1. And in 2010, Freddy would return, but not played by Robert Englund. Instead, Jackie Earle Haley would play Freddy Krueger in the 2010 remake, which was also called A Nightmare on Elm Street. Wesley Strick and Eric Hesterer wrote the screenplay, Samuel Bayer directed, and Michael Bay produced the movie. Despite being a commercial success, the movie had generally unfavourable reviews, so plans for a sequel never materialised. The movie was supposed to be a relaunch of the franchise, but most reviews found the remake to lack Freddy's gleeful sadism and didn't like the character becoming a child molester, because that was something that Craven had originally removed. But if anything good came of the Platinum Dunes remake of A Nightmare on Elm Street, it's that more attention shifted to the original film and its sequels. Not only did fans get A Nightmare on Elm Street on Blu-ray, they also got the documentary Never Sleep Again: The Elm Street Legacy, which has comprehensive interviews with cast, crew, fans and creators of each film in the series, narrated by Heather Langenkamp. It was announced on the 7th of August 2015 that David Leslie Johnson, the writer of Orphan, was working with New Line Cinema on a second remake. Englund indicated he would be interested in a cameo appearance, but that he would not return to the role of Freddy Krueger. As of 2019, the US rights to both A Nightmare on Elm Street and Freddy Krueger have returned to the estate of Wes Craven after US copyright law allows the original creator to regain the rights after 35 years. Craven passed in 2015, but at least Freddy is finally back home with the estate. New Line Cinema still own the international rights to the franchise. There have been discussions about reboots, remakes, and legacy sequels in the intervening years, but nothing has materialised yet. And New Line Cinema is often referred to as the house that Freddy built, and it's hard to believe what we wouldn't have without this tiny indie studio taking a punt on a supernatural slasher horror that they couldn't afford to make. Let's just go through a quick list of what we wouldn't have had. We wouldn't have had Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Okay, hardly an Oscar winner, but formative for many a millennial. We wouldn't have Evil Dead, The Long Kiss Goodnight, Austin Powers, Final Destination, Elf, Wedding Crashers, The Conjuring, Annabelle, Rush Hour, Straight Outta Compton, and we wouldn't have The Lord of the Rings. New Line Cinema has come a long way from being a distributor to becoming a billion-dollar production company with over 30 Academy Award nominations for one franchise. And all of that is thanks to this movie And I don't think A Nightmare on Elm Street gets enough credit for literally creating the behemoth that is New Line Cinema. And there's a lot of people to thank for the consistency of A Nightmare on Elm Street. The late Wes Craven, of course, a pioneer in slasher horror and always willing to reinvent his own genre. He was the game changer, a horror pioneer, the thinking person's horror creator. Also, Bob Shaye, the only man in Hollywood willing to give this idea a chance. Jim Doyle, for literally thinking outside of the box for these innovative visual effects that still stand up to this day. And also Robert Englund, a rare horror icon, pretty much always at the forefront. Unlike other villains with masks, Englund was front and centre and willing to continue in the role as long as possible. Even now, his version is still the de facto Freddy. Jackie Earle Haley's version just couldn't compete. Robert Englund is Freddy, and it's probably part of the reason why we've not seen more in regards to a new version. Englund is 77 now, but the role is so synonymous with him, it's hard to see it with someone else. It will happen though, because this franchise, like Krueger himself, will never truly die. Heather Langenkamp's Nancy is more resourceful than your average final girl, is proactive in stopping Freddy Krueger, and also goes full Home Alone. Or maybe Home Alone was inspired by this. She isn't running and hiding away, she faces her fears and faces Freddy full on, spilling their fight over into the real world. And yet Langenkamp has never really had the career that other final girls, like Jamie Lee Curtis, Sigourney Weaver, because yes, Ripley is technically the final girl, or Neve Campbell did. And that's a real shame. No one in this movie is going to win an acting award, but she is the standout. And certainly not Johnny Depp, although each movie I'm covering in this spooky season going forward does have their own standout star celebrity in the cast. This is ultimately a slasher that isn't just a slasher, but also a commentary on suburbia and the curse of family sin. The parents have taken vigilante justice into their own hands, and it's their children that suffer the consequences, because it's always the children that suffer most for the actions of adults. But this movie is miraculous, not just for birthing a horror icon, but also for doing it on such a low budget and making full use of some absolutely incredible visual effects, thanks to Jim Doyle and his visual effects team, their ingenuity and tenacity. The effects and Freddy Krueger are the stars of this show, and while on initial reflection the ending is a bit tame, it reminds us that Freddy is never truly dead, that you can forget the horrors of the world for only the briefest moment, until they remind you that they are still there. And while Nancy thinks this was all just a bad dream, her friends are safe and her mother is no longer a raging alcoholic, actually, none of the above is true. Freddy has beat her again and trapped her in her own nightmares forever, or at least until The Nightmare on Elm Street 3 Dream Warriors. This year is also the 40th anniversary of this movie, and it has the distinction of being one of the select few horror films to be in the Library of Congress. It's deserving, it's iconic for a reason, and while I've not seen the majority of the sequels, I have seen New Nightmare, and I really like New Nightmare, so maybe I'll do that for next spooky season. But for now, sleep easy tonight. But if your parents murdered a child murderer and incinerated his body at some point in the past, whatever you do, don't fall asleep. Thank you for listening. As always, I would love to hear your thoughts on A Nightmare on Elm Street, and thank you for your continued support of this podcast. If you want to get involved and help this podcast grow, there are a few ways that you can do that. You could tell your friends and family about this episode or about this podcast and encourage them to download a podcast app and subscribe. You can leave a rating or review wherever you found this episode. And you can also find me and follow me on social media. You can share posts and like posts on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, and Letterboxd. I am at Verbal Diorama on all of those places. And the next episode, spooky season continues. And do you remember in Scream when Ghostface is talking to Drew Barrymore's Casey Becker and is quizzing her about scary movies? He asks her to name the killer in Friday the 13th. And Casey replies, Jason, because Jason Voorhees is the main antagonist in Friday the 13th, right? But Jason, although right there at the end in the lake, doesn't show up until the sequel. So I guess we need to talk about the history and legacy of Friday the 13th next, don't we? So join me next episode for that. And I always say this podcast is free and it always will be free. However, it is not free to produce this podcast. And so I rely on some incredibly generous people to support this podcast financially. Now, you are under no obligation to do that. However, if you have some spare pennies and you get value out of this podcast, if you would like to, there are two ways you can do that. You can go to verbaldiorama.com/tips and give a one-off tip. Or you can go to verbaldiorama.com/Patreon and you can join the amazing patrons of this podcast. They are Sade, Claudia, Simon, Laurel, Derek, Kat, Andy, Mike, Luke, Michael, Scott, Brendan, Lisa, Sam, Jack, Dave, Stuart, Nicholas, Zoe, Kev, Pete, Heather, Danny, Ali, Stu, Brett, Philip M, Michelle, Zenos, Sean, Rhino, Philip K, Adam, Elaine, and Kyle. If you want to get in touch with me, you can email verbaldiorama@gmail.com, or you can go to verbaldiorama.com and fill out the little contact form. And you can also find bits and pieces that I do at filmstories.co.uk too. And finally, bye.